Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS legal hotline lawyer, and this is our 4th video in the series that we've entitled, Don't Do It. And I am still joined by my friend, Ken Sachs.
Hi folks, Ken Sachs, Managing Broker, Professional Realty Services International. I'm based out of Spokane, Washington.
And we promised you that in this video we're going to cover 2 very concise topics. Once we get going, it probably won't feel concise, I'm certain of that. But the 2 topics we're going to cover in this video are, what do you do as a buyer's broker if your buyer can't get a contractor out to the property in a timely manner to give you a bid for the work that needs to be done to solve the problem identified by the inspector? And talk a little bit about a concern that I've heard expressed about whether or not it's a waiver of the buyer's inspection contingency if the buyer attaches a bid from a contractor. So I'm going to tee up this first discussion for you, Ken. The conversation, I had said in an earlier video that I've had conversations with brokers around the state talking about this issue, and one of those conversations was with a designated broker in the Longview area where he said, here's an example, and this was a real life example for him. One of his brokers had just received a nasty email from a listing broker claiming that she had waived her buyer's inspection contingency because this is what happened. The inspector did the inspection and found, he said there were about 15 different small electrical issues scattered throughout the house, all of which needed some level of attention by an electrician. Buyer broker said to buyer, you need to have an electrician come in and give you a bid to make all of these repairs. They contacted all of the electricians they could find in the area, and the soonest that they could get one out to give a bid, he said, was 3 months out. They could have gotten somebody in hopefully to do the work, but to just give the bid, they said they're 3 months out on getting one of their few electricians in their community to give them the bid. So what happened was the buyer broker wrote on the Form 35R, seller shall hire a licensed and bonded inspector to perform, and then she cut and pasted from the inspection report the 15 or so issues of electrical work that the inspector had identified. Listing broker reacted and said, you've included a portion, which is prohibited by the language of the Form 35. You have included a portion of the inspection report in your Form 35R. Your buyer has waived the inspection contingency. Now, setting aside whether the listing broker is right or wrong, because we're going to have that debate coming up in a future video, setting that aside for a moment, is there a way to avoid that argument, Ken? How could the broker have solved her buyer's problem of not being able to get an electrician into the house? And brokers, I don't want you to take what we're about to say as an easy punt to say, oh, forget it, we don't need to try and get an electrician into the house, because that's wrong. Still the best solution is to have an electrician in this case give you a bid for the work that needs to be done, and you attach that bid to the Form 35R using the language we gave you in the last video. Only if you really, truly can't make that happen, for whatever reason, then and only then would you do something along the lines of what we've just described, seller shall hire a licensed and bonded electrician to perform the following work. Okay, now, Ken, if we feel like we need to include cut and paste language from the inspector's report, what's the first thing buyer brokers you should do in that scenario?
Well, and that's the real deal, folks, especially in today's market. Vendors are busy, and that you may really not be able to get somebody in there with the time you have. Are you leading me to seller's consent?
Talk about that.
Okay, so one of our new forms that was born March 21 is the 35C, C for consent, and that is a form that would enable seller to give buyer consent to deliver portions of the report or the report itself. We didn't have that form before. We had to rely on emails, and it just wasn't very clear. Now it's clear.
And now it's clear. So Ken, let's play out how this might work between buyer broker and listing broker. I'm buyer broker. I've got this problem. I can't get an electrician in. I've got to figure out how to draft this inspection report. I'm actually going to pick up the phone, and I'm going to call you. And I'm going to say, hey, Ken, here's my problem. And I'm going to describe my problem to you. Now, Question number 1. I've described my problem to you being there's 15 items of electrical repairs called out by the inspector. We want your seller to make these repairs. I can't get an electrician in there, so I would like to have the seller's consent to deliver the portions of the inspection report that identify where the electrical issues are located. Question number 1. If I have that phone call with you and I tell you what the inspection report says, in that it identifies 15 electrical issues, have I waived my buyer's inspection contingency?
Well, I say no, because you haven't provided me the portion of the inspection report.
And I say you're right.
Okay.
But that is a question that I hear on the hotline not infrequently. If I have a conversation with the buyer broker, listing broker, to tell them the problems, then I've waived the buyer's inspection report. Or coming from the listing broker's perspective, they have waived the inspection contingency. And the answer is?
That's ridiculous.
It's not what the Form 35 says. Let's not carry Form 35 farther than what it actually says.
I mean, we're still trying to be problem solvers, and we're still trying to sell a house, buyer buy and seller sell. We have to communicate.
Yeah, my favorite tagline for the year is broker the deal, right? You're a broker a deal. Pick up the phone, have a conversation with the listing broker, try to get seller's consent to a portion of the report. Listing broker might say, no. If my seller signs something that says I'm going to give you permission to give me a portion of the report, you're going to give me too much. I don't want that. My seller's not going to do it. Hopefully that's not what happens. Hopefully, in a perfect world, the seller says, I'll consent to receive the portions of the report necessary to the request that you're making. And if seller says that, great, off you go. Some sellers are reasonably going to say, no, I don't even want that. And I'm not suggesting, I think it sounded like I was suggesting, I'm really not suggesting what any seller should say in that given situation, because it is a big deal. It's a big deal for a seller to get part of a buyer's inspection report. And it may be that seller doesn't want any portion of it, and that's a reasonable conclusion for a seller to reach. That's fine. So let's then play it out further. Let's say seller doesn't consent to receive any portion of buyer's inspection report. What then, Ken? We want to avoid the allegation that we've waived the inspection report by cutting and pasting any portion of the inspection report. What do you as buyer's broker then have to do with these 15 items of electrical repair?
We're going to have to ask the seller to fix them and draft a 35R.
And so we're going to start with that same language. Seller shall hire a licensed and bonded electrician to resolve or to repair the following items. And then if we can't cut and paste from the inspector's report, what are you going to do?
We're going to use the report as reference, and we're going to simply restate what it is we want seller to do from looking at the report and what's being called out.
If you can't get seller's consent to receive portions of the report, then you're going to retype portions of the report.
Well, and here's where we often go sideways. I've seen it so many times, is we don't stick with just what we want the seller to do. Is it too early to go there? We start putting in language like, and this is why, and this is what the inspector said, and this is what's wrong, and this is what could happen, and the house could blow up, and how is that? You want the seller to do that? What do you want the seller to do?
So Ken, here's an example. Here's an example. The inspection report says there's a faulty GFI to the right of the kitchen sink. Here's what can happen, if the faulty GFI switch isn't fixed, and here's, whatever. I recommend that you have an electrician in to look at the GFI switch. What do you actually say on the Form 35R as the buyer's broker? We've got all that information in the inspection report. What do you actually take out of that information, synthesize down to put on the Form 35R, following the statement, seller shall hire a licensed and bonded electrician to perform the following work?
So I want the GFCI replaced on the right side of the kitchen sink. So I will write seller to replace the GFCI to the right of the kitchen sink.
Okay. And that's it. And that's it. That's all you're going to say, right? You're not going to give any other explanation about what the significance of the bad GFI is.
Doesn't matter.
Okay. So then this designated broker I'm talking with in Longview, who's a very competent designated broker, says, really? Does that even make sense to elevate form over substance, and in doing so put my broker in the position that they might inadvertently transpose something, leave out an important word, make some kind of a typo in their drafting that results in a discrepancy between what the inspector has identified as a problem and the solution they're seeking?
So in my head, I'm thinking of reasonable skill and care. So instead of drafting it on your phone at a red light, in your office, take time, draft it. Maybe an office mate, maybe the buyer, your client. Hey, office mate, buyer, could you read this and tell me what it says and compare it to the actual report? So we are doing everything we can, exercising reasonable skill and care, that we didn't make a mistake.
Yeah. And I agree with you. That's what you have to do. In fact, long ago when I was a lawyer in a big firm and would put together a purchase and sale agreement, this was before we could cut and paste legal descriptions from a title report. We actually had a firm policy that said when I typed out, or any lawyer typed out a legal description, we were required by firm policy to have somebody else in the office hold the title report legal description while I read what I had typed, and they had to compare it so that it was exactly word for word. No discrepancies, no close enough, no good enough is good enough, but it had to be exact. And that's what we're talking about here also, buyer brokers. If you are left in the unfortunate position of having to retype something from the inspector's report, get a third person, the buyer or another broker or somebody, to read with you what you have typed on the Form 35R compared to what the inspector called out. You've got to be super careful.
Standard in care of an attorney.
Ken's right. When you draft a Form 35R or any purchase and sale agreement document, you're held to the standard of care of a lawyer in preparing that document. Okay, really fast before we leave this video. One of the questions that I've heard is it a waiver? Isn't it a waiver? It's presented to me in that question form. Isn't it a waiver of the buyer's inspection contingency if buyer delivers a bid from a contractor when a bid from a contractor can provide just as much information to the seller about the problems in their home as the inspector's report?
So again, back to the language in the form, that's not a portion of the inspection report, a bid from a contractor.
That's right. It's not. So folks, I understand the concern. The concern is, again, to talk form over substance, right? If you're telling me that I can't provide the inspection report, which explains the problem, but I can provide a contractor's bid, which explains the problem, then how is that not elevating form over substance to the seller's detriment? And here's the difference. The Form 35 language was never intended to shield sellers from actual knowledge about the condition of the property related to the repairs that a buyer is seeking. The Form 35 prohibition is an attempt to shield the seller from extraneous information that is beyond the scope of what buyer is seeking as a concession, intended to impair seller's ability to resell the property later. So if the seller is delivered, because Ken is exactly right, nothing in Form 35 prohibits buyer's delivery of a contractor's bid asking for work to be done. Nothing. And a court is not going to create a remedy bigger than the contract language itself allows. The court's not going to extrapolate from contract language to say, well, if this wasn't allowed, then this wasn't allowed either. The contract language is really clear. Buyer is prohibited from delivering a portion of buyer's inspection report. That's it. Nothing prohibits buyer from delivering a contractor's bid identifying the work that buyer actually wants to have performed. And in fact, all that buyer is doing by including that contractor's bid is informing seller of the exact work that buyer wants done. The buyer is not saying, seller, if you don't do this, then you're going to have to disclose this other big issue to another buyer later. That's not what's happening when buyer attaches a copy of contractor's bid for work to be done.
Right, we're just being super clear what we want the seller to do.
Right. So there was a big debate about this in Spokane, I understand. Have we covered what were the concerns in that debate, or is there anything else?
Well, the debate was around the language, and if I take language and put it in another a document format, it's not the inspection report, but it's the same thing, and if I deliver that, have I put seller in the same position as if I would have delivered the actual inspection report? And I think we've addressed that.
Yeah, and the answer is yes if you include a bunch of extraneous language. But if all you're taking is the location of the GFI switch that needs to be replaced and putting that in your statement, following your statement that says seller shall hire, then that's all you're doing is describing the work that has to be done and not the reasons why or the inspector's opinion, yada, yada.
Right, not trying to manipulate. Just what do you want the seller to do?
Okay. In our final video on this, in this series, we're going to talk about what I have seen as an overreaction from listing brokers, or what I would describe as an overreaction from listing brokers. Maybe some of you listing brokers would disagree with me, but that's what we're going to talk about in the next video, and how that can lead to problems for the seller and the listing broker. So if you have questions on anything we've talked about so far, or anything else, send an email to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.